Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Squarespace. So I want to start by saying that I went into Vox's video, Why the Marvel Cinematic Universe Feels So Empty, with an open mind. I think there's plenty of things the MCU could have done better through the years, and I think Vox is generally pretty thoughtful in its video essays. In fact, their video on lettering in comics is something that I've gone back to over and over again. It's well researched, has way better editing than I could ever hope to pull off, and is just an all-around great video. This one though, well, I mean, at least it's also well edited. Look, I found this video pretty baffling. It gestures at some legitimate criticisms of the MCU as a whole, and I'll be sure to point out when I think it makes something that kind of approaches a good point. But overall, it's a really weird mess that conflates a lot of Marvel history in a really strange way that, while maybe not being wrong exactly, is at least really misleading. And if this response video seems kind of disjointed and all over the place, it's because the video I'm responding to definitely is, jumping wildly between old-time radio, Golden Age comics, the MCU, and Frasier, with only the thinnest of connections. Before I start to respond though, I really encourage you to check out the video for yourself. I've put a link to it down below, so you can judge for yourself if I'm being fair. So, alright, with that being said, let's get into it.
Now we got you.
You've got me all right. Got me in perfect position for you.
So after the host Phil Edwards' introduction, he immediately says something very suspect in my mind.
Go back to 1939 and you'll find the likely birth of the Marvel Universe. It's in Marvel Mystery Comics number 7. These characters aren't that well known today, but here Betty tells Namor that the Human Torch exists.
This is a weird one, because he's right in a way. This is the first time that two characters who would later go on to be in the Marvel Universe crossed over with each other. But calling this the likely birth of the Marvel Universe seems kinda like a stretch at best, and sort of flat out wrong at worst. First of all, the company wasn't even called Marvel Comics yet. This was back in its days as Timely. This isn't really what we think of as the Marvel Universe. He goes on to compare this crossovers to others of the same kind of going on at the same general time frame, using the example of the Green Hornet and the Lone Ranger crossing over on the radio in the 1940s and the Universal monster movies crossing over with Abbott and Costello. And I think that's a totally fair comparison. I can see the similarities. But then the video pulls what I think is a bit of a sleight of hand.
By the time Spider-Man got his comic in 1963, he was spending time with the Fantastic Four and promoting guest appearances from the Hulk. And this was also when the Marvel Universe's problems started.
Did you catch what they just did here? He conflated Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four crossing over as the exact same thing as Namor and the original Human Torch 20 years earlier, treating it as though they were basically the same thing and Stan Lee and company were just continuing the universe set out by those late 30s comics. And I'm sorry, but that's just really not true. First of all, it completely devalues comic greats like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, who helped pioneer the Marvel Universe as we know it today, and who aren't even mentioned in this video. The Marvel Universe that Kirby and Lee started in Fantastic Four was completely unprecedented in comics at the time. Vox treats it as exactly the same thing as Superman and Batman meeting, but in my opinion that's kind of misleading. First of all, Marvel hadn't kept publishing superhero comics. For most of the 1950s, they were focused on things like Western and romance comics. In the post-World War II landscape, most superhero books had died off, except for the biggest name, which, incidentally, weren't at Marvel. What Lee and Kirby did in the Fantastic Four is what most people would call the true birth of the Marvel Universe, creating a living, breathing universe whose crossovers were very different than that of just a small appearance by a fellow hero or two. It carved out an entirely distinct world, one where the problems the Fantastic Four faced in Wakanda could spill over into Iron Man and Spider-Man's New York, and vice versa. And even though older characters like Namor, the original Human Torch, and Captain America were eventually worked into the continuity of what Lee, Kirby, Ditko, and the rest of the 60s Marvel team had built, make no mistake, what they built was very unique from what came before, and lumping it in with that early Timely stuff is a pretty big oversimplification in my opinion. Anyway, now let's talk about snow globes.
And don't say you're my partner. I lost my partner. Bucky died because of me. That's why I won't have another partner.
So the Vox video takes a very sudden turn out of nowhere, and pretty soon we're talking about the Tommy Westphall universe fan theory. If you don't know, basically the 80s TV medical drama St. Elsewhere has a famous ending where it's implied that the entire show takes place inside a snow globe in the mind of an autistic child. And since St. Elsewhere crossed over with a few other shows, and those shows crossed over with even more shows, pretty soon you have this really fun fan theory that says everything from Arrested Development to The Wire to I Love Lucy completely exist inside the mind of this boy in St. Elsewhere. What does this have to do with the MCU? Well, nothing, really, but okay, let's be charitable to the video and try to explain what they're getting at here. The video goes on to say, again with that editing that I'm so jealous of, that the crossovers between these shows were more for business purposes than any artistic reason. We don't want Frasier to exist in the same universe as the X-Files, so why would we want Iron Man and Black Panther to? Except, okay, this is where the video gets kind of peak goofiness to me. Frasier and the X-Files are great, and yeah, I agree with Vox that I don't need them existing in the same universe. They also occupy radically different genres, the sitcom and the supernatural mystery, so it makes sense that they would never have a reason to meet. Iron Man, Black Panther, Captain America, Spider-Man. I mean, it almost seems goofy to state the obvious here, but they're all superheroes occupying a genre that, yeah, has some variation, like you'd expect a Spider-Man story to have differences in tone from a Thor story, but they're still in the same vein, that superhero action genre. I think it's really obvious why this is nothing like I Love Lucy and The Wire being tossed into the same universe. But I take their complaint about artistic compromises needing to be made in order to maintain a shared universe a little more seriously. I think they really almost have a good point here. If I was them, and I was trying to prove their problem with Marvel's interconnected nature, I would have pointed straight to the big crossover events through the years that force writers and artists to grind the stories they want to tell to a halt in order to accommodate these larger narratives, which have really been delivering diminishing returns lately. Now that's a criticism of the way Marvel works that I could get behind, but they don't do that. Instead, they compare the Marvel Universe to the forced and hacky crossover of Happy Days and Mork and Mindy in the 70s. And look, as anyone watching my channel probably knows, there's a massive and obvious difference between a one-off sitcom crossover and comics where everything is attempting to exist in the same universe. These two things are clearly not the same thing, and it's also worth noting that unlike most of these shows, Fantastic Four and the X-Men, just to name a few, were created by the same core group of people. Now of course, thousands have added to it through the years, but acting as though Mr. Fantastic talking to Professor X is just as contrived and forced as like Alf talking to the cast of Law and Order is really goofy and disingenuous. It completely erases the authorship of Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and others, who definitely intended it to be this way. Oh, and by the way, I'm over 1,300 words into this response, and have you noticed that I've barely touched on the Marvel Cinematic Universe once? Weirdly, it takes up surprisingly little time in Vox's actual video. I think because it's easier for them to poke holes in the much messier, more expansive universe of the comics. But here they are, finally ready to get into it.
Fire the rocket quickly! Correction. I'll launch my own rocket.
So now we get to the real meat of the argument here. The MCU requires scenes like this one that Phil points out in Ant-Man, where the characters give kind of a strained excuse for why the rest of the Avengers can't be in the story. And he's not wrong. A lot of MCU movies have scenes like this, and sometimes they can feel clunky and forced. But then he says,
these heavy-handed additions are about getting crossover hype, not about telling a good story.
And I think that's kind of a reach. I'll be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of this movie, but this scene is in the film to maintain the reality of the universe that the MCU has built. If I lived in the same universe as the Avengers and I had a huge problem, I'd probably want to take that problem to them too. So it makes sense that Scott would do the same. It helps the MCU have internal logic and feel like a real place. So I think Vox is being a little unfair here. Then the video really loses me with its next point. It points to Spider-Man Homecoming as a good example of how to use the MCU, but for all the wrong reasons.
It's cool when Peter Parker's classroom has a picture of Bruce Banner in the corner, but it's not a transformed universe. It's like Quentin Tarantino including the imaginary brand of Red Apple cigarettes in multiple movies. It's cool. It's not a coherent, intertwined world.
He's saying it's good because the references to the rest of the MCU are more small Easter eggs than anything else. And I like those small touches too, but it ignores one huge thing. The entire story of Homecoming, the reason Spidey is facing off against the Vulture at all, is completely built off the foundation of the MCU movies that came before it. Adrian Toomes is angry because he feels like Tony Stark's company has screwed him over on the cleanup of New York after the Avengers. His illegal business is entirely built on selling Jatari technology left behind from that battle. Literally, the villain's motivations only exist because of the events of earlier movies. Vox is trying to play it off like Homecoming's references to the rest of the MCU are only skin deep, when, if anything, Homecoming is more indebted to the existing continuity of the MCU than the vast majority of Marvel movies. It just uses that in a smarter and more thoughtful way than older entries like Ant-Man. Another MCU movie that Vox conveniently doesn't mention at all is Thor Ragnarok. I mean, come on, this thing is a pretty direct crossover, the Hulk and Thor teaming up. Does it feel like their Happy Days and Mork and Mindy example from earlier, where the two are shoved together for purely commercial reasons, with no artistic merit to be found? I'm guessing Vox didn't want to have to make that argument, because most people kind of agree that Ragnarok was a really fun, creative movie that used the pairing between Thor and Bruce Banner really well. When you look at that movie, it's really hard to take their comparison to the Tommy Westphall fan theory universe seriously. Anyway, then Vox moves on to a point that made their comment section very angry.
Add Aquaman to that poster. If you didn't know DC owned him, would anyone notice? The MCU has no rules beyond corporate ownership. It's a superhero hodgepodge.
I get his point. It is weird that Iron Man and Doctor Strange exist in the same world, but I think he's kind of missing the appeal of that structure. The Marvel Universe is a lot like our own, except more fantastical in every way. One of the elements that I think attracts people to the interconnected universe concept is that in Marvel Comics, it doesn't matter if you're an average teen, a genius inventor, a Norse god, whatever. There's always something weird and outside the boundaries of reality around every corner. Every legend you grew up with, every monster you're scared of, and every power you can imagine. They're all there, existing together at once, playing off each other, having their own stories that could play out among the stars, or on a regular street not that different from yours or mine. So yeah, Vox is right. The Marvel Universe could easily fit a guy from Atlantis into things. In fact, they already have one that Phil mentioned earlier. But in my mind, that's not a weakness, that's a strength. And it's why this fictional universe, flaws and all, has engaged people's imagination for decades now.
It's working. It's just like water skiing on dry land.
Next up, Vox positively cites the Fox X-Men universe as a better way to build an interconnected universe. And look, I like a lot of those movies, and I'm not even the type that gets really hung up over how weird and nonsense the timeline for that series is. I think Phil has one decent point here too, that the brand management of Disney probably wouldn't let something like Logan get made, but...
And even tonal experimentation with deep integration to the X-Men mythology.
Come on, that's a bit of a stretch. No X-Men movie has ever integrated its universe as elegantly as like Homecoming did in the MCU, to cite an example from earlier. And I think even Fox's willingness to change tones is kind of overstated. Logan and Deadpool, and maybe First Class notwithstanding, the vast majority of Fox X-Men movies have this kind of similar, blandish, Bryan Singer visual style and tone. Now don't get me wrong, I like X2 as much as the next guy, but come on, acting like the Fox movies are some sort of bastion of experimentation is just wrong. There's a sameness to a lot of those films that Vox is accusing the MCU of. And to be fair to Vox, their criticisms of Netflix's take on the MCU is pretty correct. I've been a little let down by how many of those shows pay lip service to the events of the movie, without often examining the actual effect that the events of those movies would have on the people of New York. But citing the X-Men movies as a more thoughtful counterexample, yeah, sorry, I'm just not buying it. And lastly, this.
But right now, would anybody be surprised if Disney forced a Marvel Star Wars crossover?
Yeah, Phil. I mean, I would. Through the course of this video, Vox throws a lot at the viewers. Radio dramas, fan theories, the X-Men, the Fonz, but what does it all add up to? I think a pretty simple message. Crossovers are outlandish and artistically bankrupt. That's an opinion you're free to agree with or disagree with. But to pretend that the universe Kirby, Ditko, Lee, and so many others created is comparable to the shallow crossovers of a few 70s sitcoms seems a little ridiculous to me. You know, one of the things that I've always engaged with most in the Marvel Universe is the total sense of possibility. There's always something new out there to discover in it. The real world can't really match that, sure, but that doesn't mean it isn't filled with possibilities too. And to take a step towards a lot of those possibilities, those dreams really, chances are pretty good you'll need a website, and that's where Squarespace comes in. No matter where you want to go, from starting a blog, promoting a business idea you have, or selling something you've already made with their great e-commerce tool, Squarespace makes building a website a really fun creative process, as you mix and match what you love in templates made by world-class designers, while never having to worry about patches or updates. Not to mention their 24/7 award-winning customer support. So come on, chase down that possibility. Go to squarespace.com/CaptainMidnight and use the offer code CaptainMidnight, all one word, to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. That's squarespace.com/CaptainMidnight, offer code CaptainMidnight.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once, because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started, because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.